This is E&P Reports from Editor and Publisher Magazine, the authoritative voice of news media since 1884, serving newspapers, broadcasts, digital, and all multimedia news publishing. And greetings once again, Mike Linder, publisher of E&P Magazine. Housekeeping as usual, listening to us on a podcast platform. We urge you to follow us, watching us on our YouTube channel. Hit the subscribe button, hit the bell to the right. We'll give you an update each and every time we upload a new episode of E&P Reports. As usual, whenever I have to be kept honest, we're bringing into our platform today from E&P, our contributing editor, Gretchen Peck. Gretchen, thank you for your valuable time this morning. I appreciate you being here.
My pleasure. Nice
Joining
to join
us,
you.
joining us also from the Washington Post, Jon Gerberg, senior video journalist. Jon, you're an award-winning video journalist. I want to brag and all that, but you joined the Washington Post in 2017, foreign affairs producer for PBS NewsHour. You worked overseas for the Times, Associated Press. It's an honor to have you on board, sir. Thank you for being with us.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you.
And Stephen Rich. Stephen, you've been at the Post now for almost 10 years, but you have an interesting title. We're going to do a deep dive more into what you've been doing for the Post. You are database editor for investigations, meaning that the data you've been collecting for 10 years is turning into journalism. This is such an interesting thing for 10. It's almost like you've been ahead of the curve because it's only been recently that we've been doing so much reporting on database journalism. How did you get the gig? What does this all mean to you, Stephen?
I mean, I got the job here at the Post through an internship. I turned that internship into a second internship into a job. At the time, there was not as much data capacity at the Post. They sort of needed me, and I was focused largely on large investigative projects, doing the data work, which I see as sort of a contextual job. Like, my job is to take your anecdotes and to tell you how often they happen. And so these are that's sort of how I broadly see what I do, but it's more complicated than that. And as far as being ahead of the curve, I would argue that we're kind of behind it. Data journalism has kind of been under the surface for a very long time. I would argue back over 100 years when folks like Ida B. Wells was collecting data on the lynchings that were happening across the South, which I would argue was kind of premature data journalism before you could enter all these things into a computer.
Let's take a break. Let's get our sponsor out of the way here, and we'll get back and talk data journalism with Jon Gerberg and Stephen Rich on the backside of this message.
This episode of E&P Reports is sponsored by IQ Audience Plus by Town News. Consumer revenue has never been more important. Digital leaders at media organizations worldwide are asking the same question. How do we accelerate the growth of consumer revenue? Traditional one-size-fits-all paywalls aren't the answer. They're blunt instruments that treat all visitors the same way, costing you money. IQ Audience Plus by Town News is a smart, dynamic metering solution that empowers you to maximize revenue by identifying key audiences, seeding engagement, and growing membership and subscriptions. Ready to supercharge your consumer revenue, grow engagement, and bolster your advertising income? Visit townnews.com/EP today to learn more about IQ Audience Plus by Town News.
All right, Gretchen, it all started, this interview, through a specific article that we saw that the Washington Post did when a call to the police for help turns deadly. And in the article basically showed a specific number, in at least 178 cases over 3 years, law enforcement killed the individuals they were called to assist. Gretchen, why don't you take it from here? Why did that article come to life, and what questions do you want to ask the two gentlemen here from the Washington Post?
Well, I thought maybe we could start with you, Jon, a little bit about that particular story. If you can walk us through that 2020 incident with Damian Daniels, who was an Army vet, who had 3 encounters, if I recall correctly, with police officers that day. Ultimately, he was shot and killed. How did you come by this story?
Great. Yeah. It was in the last 48 hours of his life, Mr. Daniels had 3 encounters with the police. And we were interested honestly, this Unaccountable series that the Post has been producing has taken a lot of different bites out of the apple of police accountability and how police serve the communities they're tasked to protect. And we have seen, a lot of these cases, again, anecdotally, where people called the police to be helped, primarily concerned for either their own well-being or for the well-being of a neighbor or a son or daughter, or not where no imminent harm was reported, and the police ended up coming and killing the individual. Some of these are high stakes, high publicity cases. Daniel Prude in upstate New York, Walter Wallace Jr. in Philadelphia. And it was one of those things where you feel like you hear this a lot, but we wanted to know, how often is this actually happening? And that's where we turn to colleagues like Stephen, who have actually been compiling this database. And we were able to look at, we started with the 1,000 cases of a year where we know where police shoot and kill individuals. Mm-hmm. And then we looked at the data points we had to see how could we kind of parse that down to determine at least a baseline number. And we knew from the beginning that we were only going to have an at least number, not a fully comprehensive number. Okay. But we were able to pull out from the database all the cases where mental health was reported as an element in the encounter, which mm-hmm. gave us at least a good starting point. To be clear, there are cases where mental health is not reported as an element of the encounter, where police that are still fit our criteria, right? Where a call for help resulted in the police shooting and killing the very person they were called on to assist. Mm-hmm. But that gave us a good starting point. And then we had to go back through the database with a team of students at American University. Mm-hmm. And we went through each of those cases through public reporting and additional reporting that we could come up with to determine how many of those cases actually fit our criteria to see how much this happened.
So the database that, Stephen, you've been compiling for 7 years, I believe you said, besides this type of data, what else have you been tracking in it?
So the database, we set out in early 2015 to be as comprehensive as possible, to track everything we could about police shootings that we believed to be relevant. Okay. And so we tracked whether or not the folks who were shot and killed were armed. We wanted to know where they were broadly and very specifically. So were they inside their own homes? Were they on the street? And one of those factors was, why are police even on the scene at all? And so that's sort of where this story came from, is, we kept seeing these calls for help. We kept seeing people who needed help, and the only option for them in their community was 911. And that's why the police were there. There isn't a number to call for mental health services. And so naturally it ends up in the hands of police, who are by and large not particularly well trained for those situations.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious about your background. Was it journalism, Steve, or is it data driven? I mean, what compelled you to get the gig, and where did you start? Did you have a journalism degree, or is it more data driven, your background?
I do have a journalism degree from the University of Missouri, but I originally went to school trying to get a degree in aerospace engineering from Virginia Tech. I realized pretty quickly that I wasn't going to enjoy my day job, and sort of bounced around, and then ended up going to grad school because I wanted to do journalism. And at that time, Tech didn't have a journalism program. And so I sort of wanted to do long form journalism. And then somebody, Coulter Jones, who was then the running NICAR, which is the National Institute for Computer Assisted Reporting, introduced me to the concept of data journalism. And I realized with my math brain that it made sense to me. I understood and could naturally sort of spreadsheets, coding, all of that stuff made sense. And I found sort of the right niche for me in journalism. And so it was kind of a little bit of both. I set out wanting to do journalism and then fell into the data stuff because it was in my wheelhouse already.
Jon, when you met with the students at American University, Were they mostly journalists? Were some of them like Steve here and kind of nerdy, data driven, or was it a combination of both? What was that youthful element that helped you guys really investigate the story like at AU?
Well, they're students. They're in a journalism class in a journalism track, so they've already kind of identified that this is an interest of theirs at least. But everybody has their own path to getting to this profession.
Well, I mean, when we report on data journalism, this is more, I think, for I think this is more of a Steve question. It's not the way you are presenting it, Steve. You're presenting it with a very journalistic approach. And this is just me because I'm on the business side. I did not come through journalism. I'm an ad guy and I manage, in this magazine now. It was a way to generate more content with less need for people. Do you understand? This is how a lot of the reporting is coming together. If you're not doing data journalism, you're losing a really cool way to have more content, more eyeballs, without having to hire more people in your newsroom, because everybody is so trying, all newsrooms are now under such stress. What say you to that? I mean, because that's been some of the way we've been presenting the story.
So I think that's partially true. I mean, I think that my approach to data journalism is and has always been as a way to take a great story and make it excellent. Like, we have a lot of these really good anecdotes, and I think it's unfair to our readers to not tell them whether what we're writing about is an outlier or the trend. Because too much in journalism, we write about outliers as if they're happening everywhere. And that's just not good journalism because it's not true. And so I like to bring that context. The database itself drives a whole lot of traffic to the site because it is constantly, every time there is another bad shooting, people come to the site. They want to be able to see. And so I think that it sort of does both. It adds context and it drives a lot of traffic to a thing that we keep up on a daily basis, which is the actual database itself.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Jon?
If I could just add to that, yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Stephen, and I mean the data really is the kind of the fundamental spine of our reporting, because why are we telling these stories if they do not tell us something about the world in which we live, right? I would just add that if you kind of take the inverse of that, if you only have the data and are never taking stories out of that, what does it mean in the first place? I think a crucial part of our job is to take that data and identify those trends, but also work to really illuminate and understand what kind of consequences these trends are having in the lives of everyday people.
I mean, I have previously argued that the most important part of data journalism is the journalism itself. To Jon's point, it's like it's one thing to collect data, but you have to actually extract the meaning out of it. And the meaning are the people for the most part. Like, telling these people's stories is way more impactful than throwing numbers at you. The numbers are helpful for understanding that person's story, but it's not, you can't just have the data by itself.
I wanted to ask about we use data for, looking and assessing patterns. And I noticed in your article, Jon, with Alice, that you had mentioned that the officer who shot and killed Army vet Damian Daniels had prior shootings, had been charged with domestic violence. I wonder if, as you're looking through this data, if you've gleaned any other patterns or commonalities about these events.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we looked at that a lot, and it's kind of hard given the sample that we have of this kind of subset of cases. What I can say is, we were able to try to identify whether these trends broke down differently along racial lines, along age or gender lines. But we actually found in this case, these calls for help did happen to people of all ages, of all races, things like that. I think Stephen might be able to talk more generally of how the demographics break down in police killings overall. We've thought it was important in this case, which is again why we've really decided to focus on Mr. Daniels for this case was there are other things that don't come up in the database. For instance, what was the background of the officer that fired the fatal shots? And it was only by looking deeply into the background of the officer that we unearthed previous complaints and charges that were later dropped, I should say. But issues of concern that even his own department had suspended him at one point, had looked into him multiple times, and then those issues ended up resurfacing and ending with the killing of a citizen.
So does that insight then, Stephen, kind of guide you perhaps on how you populate this database in the future?
Yeah, it also helps us to identify stories that we want to do that are sort of out of the database, but not in the database.
Okay.
So like over the years, we've found plenty of stories that I would argue are out of this database, but not specifically in it, which are things like police officers who are fired and then forced to be rehired because of union contracts. We did a story on how police have become increasingly unable to solve homicides, and specifically where in cities they can't solve homicides. So we found these neighborhoods where essentially murder is effectively legal because cops never make an arrest. And Unaccountable is sort of the next generation of that. It has spanned this story. It has stories about police officers involved in multiple settlements. It has there's an entire podcast dedicated to no-knock raids. And so many of these stories come out of the reporting that we do, or the things that we see in individual cases within the larger database itself.
Very cool.
I want to ask about the data in general. You've been there for 10 years. Is all the data, is it all about crime and violence? The last three stories I remember that we saw database journalism were tragic. It was there was one about a small paper in Washington State that discovered missing Native American women that just go off, that never get investigated. When we looked at how it was creating lots of eyeballs, there was always these databases going up on newspaper websites now showing where crime was, and then they'd be tied into maybe real estate and relocation sites. Is there anything else that you're compiling, or is it mostly just crime and violence stuff, Steve?
You're kind of asking the wrong guy. I'm based on the investigative team, so
okay.
It's kind of the doom and gloom beat. Like one of the bigger projects that I've worked on outside of this was on prescription opioids. And so a few years ago, we and some of our colleagues at HD Media, which owns a few newspapers in West Virginia.
We know them well. Yeah.
Yeah. Sued to free some of this DEA data on where prescription pills were being sent across the country. And we've done really big stories out of that. We also work to make sure that data, which was very large and very difficult to open, was downloadable by local outlets in smaller chunks so that they could actually do analysis of their own communities. But yeah, a lot of what I focus on is sort of like our problems. And so it's going to be sort of the doom and gloom. But there are plenty of databases out there that sort of can illuminate and in ways that are not like that. There's data on just about everything out there. It's just that my focus is on the investigative topics.
Jon, do you remember a story of any kind that might have been data driven, that was, that you can actually eat ice cream and lose weight, or anything that would be a little less doom and gloom oriented? I'm just curious.
I also end up in doom and gloom land more than I would like, whether it's data stories and investigative stories, or going to cover the war in Ukraine or anything else. So they tend to send us to the places where there's a well-warranted need to tell hard stories, but it doesn't always end up with eating ice cream at the end of the day.
Well, Mike, it may not be ice cream, but it's not all doom and gloom. I was reading that in the case of Damian Daniels, that particular county, Bexar County, is now sending mental health clinicians out on calls where I guess the 9/11 call indicates that there may be a mental health factor at play. So
there's an upside to the reporting.
Yeah, the journalism resonated there. I hope you can comment a little bit about that, Jon.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, first of all, San Antonio, which is in Bexar County, had a mental health response unit within its own police department. The problem was Mr. Daniels was actually in the jurisdiction of the Bexar County sheriffs rather than the SAPD. So different jurisdiction. But since Mr. Daniels' killing, the judge there has implemented a secondary program to increase mental health options for the rest of the county as well. But to your point, I mean, we did see, Gretchen, the need to kind of push this story forward in a more, solutions oriented direction. We never know if it's going to be positive or not, but kind of look at what people are doing about this. Where does the story go forward? And there are organizations all over the country. We went to Atlanta with one group called Policing Alternatives and Diversion, where they work with actually 311 for residents to be able to call 311 instead of 911 for help with mental health related things. There's actually now an initiative across the country where specifically for suicide prevention and things, but mental health fits into a broader thing here. You can call 988 across most of the country for these types of calls, which is obviously not 911. It depends where you're calling and where that call gets routed to. So there's still a long way to go. But there's a lot of organizations trying to tackle this in different ways. And some say there should be more mental health training for officers. Some say we should have separate mental health specialists working with officers. Some people say we need to erase police from the equation altogether and have independent bodies that deploy by themselves. And everybody acknowledges that this stuff is complicated. So we really wanted to look at some of these organizations that are trying to do something about the problem. We hope that, doing this kind of reporting can contribute to the conversation as people try to solve these problems in their own communities.
It obviously already has. And you don't even know the ripple effects. There may be communities right now rejiggering based on the factual gut reporting you guys did, driven from data. Steve, I was amazed that maybe I shouldn't be amazed that you gladly helped our friends at HD Media. Lee Wolverton, we know him well. We cover some of the things they're doing down there in West Virginia. My question to you is this common? Are you working in tandem with other publishers? You realize you got thousands now listening to your email box is going to go nuts with media companies asking for collaboration with you. How much collaborating are you doing with this massive amount of data that the Washington Post has been putting together?
So this wasn't like a direct collaboration. We both just happened to sue for the same data and then linked up.
Okay,
and
cool.
So it wasn't like a from the start. But when we're thinking about this data, and when we think about data broadly, I like to think about the resources we have and that others often don't. And so when we do these projects, we try to make our data available in manageable chunks for people in smaller communities and for places all over, because we can write these big, sweepy national stories, but we don't have time to get into every community to write every story through our data. And so we think it's important, whether it was the police shootings data broadly or the prescription pill data, to make this data available so that people can tell their own stories, because there are thousands of stories in the data and even we don't have the resources to tell them all. So I see data journalism as sort of a way for us to get good information in the hands of communities, whether it's journalists or just people in those communities themselves, so that they can better understand the world that they specifically live in.
Jon, this has got to make your job a little bit easier too. I mean, it's hard to do investigative journalism, as you know, but when you start with data, doesn't it make it a little easier when you start to do your investigation, because you can lead with that information to your source, right? Say, here is fact that we already know. Go ahead, Jon. What were you going to say?
Absolutely. Yeah, it is. I mean, it's the investigative spine of our stories, and it allows us to kind of go deeper into individual cases because we know that this is representative of something bigger. I'd also just to underscore the work that Stephen and Jen Jenkins and others are doing, like this, what's unique about this police shootings database is this isn't a piece of data that they FOIA'd for and were able to just get as a single file and then process.
Right.
They had to build this database from scratch because the whole point was there was no centralized database being kept of how many people are killed by police every year. And our colleagues, Wes Lowry and others, decided we can make this for ourselves because it's not out there. It doesn't exist. So they actually created the database in the first place that now is a gift to us as their colleagues, and also anybody that wants can go online and see the raw data that they are compiling to build stories, again, from their own communities. If you want to go and say, how many police have been killed in the city of San Antonio, you can go and run the data on that and see. So it's kind of a gift that keeps on giving from a storytelling and reporting perspective.
Jennifer, bring this home. Final questions for our guests.
Well, I wanted to revisit a question we talked about earlier, just about the importance of data journalism. And you mentioned, Stephen, that this has been around for centuries, but really we only have data journalism as a title in recent years. I often am asked by young journalists coming into the scene, what should I do? How should I professionally develop? And the first thing that I say is learn how to work with data. How important is it for journalists coming into the field to really learn how to find data, mine it, manipulate it, and glean insight from it?
I mean, I'm obviously biased here, but I think it's very, very important. I think that the reality is that we are able to find really good stories by just analyzing a little bit of government data. And so it ends up being like a really good thing on every beat. And you don't have to necessarily do what I do. You don't have to get that in depth, but being able to file a records request and get an Excel spreadsheet and do basic analysis on it can take you a long way. It will get you stories that your competitors just don't have. And in a business that is largely driven by the stories that you do before anyone else, it is a very good and not terribly difficult way to get those stories. I mean, I think that it's useful across every beat. I think it's useful across every specialty. And in a newsroom like the Washington Post, we have people like me who are very specialized in these things. But in a lot of newsrooms around the country, it's people who's are reporters who do the data on the side that really make a difference in their newsrooms because they're able to make their stories better. They're able to make the stories of their colleagues better. And good journalism is good for the country, is good for the world. And so I think that data journalism is super essential to that.
Jon, same question to you, especially to that. I love the way Gretchen posed it, because we have a lot of young journalists who will listen to this program and want to know how they can make the name for themselves or grow within the industry. What advice would you give to younger Jon Gerberg about data and understanding it when you were going to journalism school?
Yeah, I would agree that these kind of investigative tools are crucial for any type of journalism that you're doing. I think all journalism is investigative at its root. I think you should familiarize with these tools that are accessible to you right now. And I think the more that you are familiar with the tools that are at your disposal, the more you start looking for it. Even it shapes the way you approach your stories in the first place. And you may be walking in to whether it's a town council or a hospital or wherever you are, you might start thinking, okay, what are the documents that might be available for this? How is this information being stored? Just asking the right questions about who is keeping this data in the first place, and can I talk to them? How do I get a hold of them? What format are you keeping this in? Can I get my hands on it? And knowing if you need to file an Information Act request, how to do that, and what documents you were asking for in the first place can go a long way to opening up the real kind of investigative spine of your story.
For those of you listening to this vodcast on an audio platform, head back to editor and publisher, A&D, publisher.com/vodcast. If you reference the page we've embedded this story on, you will see a link to the story When a Call to the Police for Help Turns Deadly, the one that kind of made us seek out you gentlemen. And then, of course, a link to the ongoing series Unaccountable. I want to thank, on behalf of all of us here at E&P, Jon Gerberg, senior video journalist at the Washington Post, Stephen Rich, database editor for investigations at the Post, 10 years working on one incredible database, and of course, contributing editor Gretchen Peck from editor and publisher. Thanks to all of you for your valuable time. Stay well, stay healthy, and I got to say, Stephen, get out sometime, get some sunlight, stay away from that computer screen if you can.
Look, I run a wood shop on the side, so like I need that. I know I need that time away, and I get it.
And Jon, thanks for the incredible journalism you're doing there as well.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you.